Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a topic prompted by the sources you've shared with us, the fascinating, sometimes messy, but absolutely crucial world of partnerships and resources in church planting.
That's right. Our mission for this deep dive is to pull out the most important insights from this stack of material, giving you a shortcut to understanding a dynamic and a sometimes debated area of global mission.
We'll be digging into the historical roots, how this looks in the modern landscape, the ups and the downs, and yes, the really vital role of finances when groups try to collaborate to see the gospel spread.
So, okay, let's unpack this. When the sources talk about partnership in this context, what exactly are we talking about, and why does it feel like, it's gaining so much traction right now?
Well, reading through this material, something that really jumped out at me is that this idea of working together in missions isn't a new invention at all. I mean, it's been happening for centuries.
Absolutely. A powerful example mentioned is John Williams back in the 18th century in the Pacific Islands. He established a base, worked on translation, built training centers, and even a boat. But the sources highlight that it was the local people,
Right.
described as native teachers with limited formal training, but wow, immense courage, who did most of the actual evangelism, venturing out to other islands.
So that early collaboration was essential.
Totally essential for rapid expansion across a vast area.
And the logic just feels so inherent to the gospel itself, doesn't it? It moves from one people group to another, and it seems like a really natural progression for those who have just received it to team up with those who brought it, to keep the movement going.
Precisely. No single church, organization, or even continent has all the necessary resources, wisdom, or reach to see the Great Commission fulfilled alone. Collaboration becomes not just helpful, but essential given the scale of the task.
Now, speaking of scale and momentum, one quote that really caught my eye comes from Christopher Little. He calls the International Partnership Movement, or IPM, the most influential force affecting the global church today. That feels like a really strong statement.
It is, and the sources suggest this rise in momentum is directly linked to globalization and the maturing of what are called new sending nations, largely from the global south. Churches and missionaries from places like Africa, Asia, and Latin America are increasingly stepping onto the global stage, and they often approach collaboration creatively, emphasizing equality and mutual respect rather than falling into older hierarchical models.
And Paul Gupta, looking specifically at India, he articulates a practical value of this shift.
Yeah.
He suggests expatriates can move from being the primary pioneers to serving more as trainers or consultants.
Right, helping national churches develop their own movement.
And equip their own leaders. This pivot towards a partnership model, he believes, can lead to a greater impact.
So, zeroing in on church planting, the material defines a partnership simply as a voluntary, collaborative association formed specifically for the purpose of planting churches.
And when done well, it's described as a healthy sharing of resources and ideas within relationships, characterized by mutual respect and trust. The aim is to help facilitate the reproduction of healthy indigenous churches.
The sources also encourage updating our vocabulary, They suggest moving away from the sending versus receiving language, which can create a perpetual sense of one group being dependent.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Instead, they use expatriate for the partner who travels cross-culturally and local for the partner in the specific place where the church is being planted. This acknowledges that churches grow, mature, and eventually become sending bases themselves.
Okay, so we see the logic and the modern momentum. But is this just a pragmatic strategy? Or does the material suggest a deeper foundation?
It absolutely points to both a strong biblical and practical basis. The overarching goal is clearly accelerating the Great Commission. We see patterns in Scripture, like Paul and Timothy relying on the support of the Philippians to advance the gospel, or Paul looking to the church in Rome for help to get to Spain. Partnerships are a strategic way to combine the different gifts and resources needed for this massive undertaking.
And it feels like it's about more than just combining resources efficiently, right? The source mentions how it demonstrates reciprocal care and support, like the Philippians caring for Paul and him sending Epaphroditus back to them.
Exactly. And the famine relief effort, that wasn't just a transfer of funds, it was an act of unity between Gentile churches and the Jerusalem church, building bridges across cultural lines.
A crucial principle highlighted is that healthy partnerships empower, they don't control.
Yes. Think about Paul's decision not to baptize many Corinthians to avoid division centered around his name, or the early leaders choosing not to impose Jewish customs on Gentile believers in Acts 15. The point is that partners should maintain their distinct cultural identities, contribute from their unique strengths, learn from each other, and work towards the shared goal without one side dominating the other.
And that diversity of gifts, resources, and cultural understanding creates synergy. The sources remind us that Paul recruited co-workers from the very churches he planted, leveraging their local insight.
Yeah, and Ecclesiastes 4.9-12 even offers timeless wisdom about the benefits of working together, greater returns, protection, help, warmth, strength, all those things.
And just as good stewards manage resources, the sources suggest that wise partnership requires regularly evaluating the impact and fruitfulness together, echoing the principles in Luke 16.
Okay, stepping beyond the basics, what other benefits does the material point to?
Well, collaboration helps partners tackle the overwhelming scale of world evangelization and ensures better stewardship of the diverse resources God has distributed across the global church, especially, as you said, with the rise of those Southern Hemisphere sending nations.
And something else that stood out to me is the idea of partnerships as learning communities. Newer sending nations bring fresh energy, perspectives, and personnel, while often learning from established organizations about things like administrative or support structures.
And what's really fascinating here is that the flow of ideas isn't just from west to east anymore, is it?
No, not at all. We're seeing church growth strategies like cell churches, approaches to spiritual warfare, and methods for reaching postmodern people increasingly influencing churches in the West, coming from Africa, Asia, and Latin America. It's a two-way street now.
Case study 18.1 provides a powerful illustration of this learning process. It tells of an experienced American church planter in Central Asia who struggled for 7 years without seeing any converts, despite building many friendships.
Right. Then a Korean missionary joined him. The Korean had fewer traditional resources but brought boldness and a keen understanding of the local culture.
And that cultural savvy was key, apparently.
Absolutely. The Korean helped the American realize that his approach to friendship evangelism wasn't matching the local Uzbek expectations of what friendship actually entailed. So they strategically shifted their focus. Instead of just making friends and hoping conversations developed, they intentionally sought out receptive people, men of peace, referencing Luke 10.6, and initiated spiritual discussions much more directly and immediately.
And this simple, culturally attuned shift unlocked homes for the gospel and led to church plants. They even conducted Bible studies openly to build trust and allay suspicion.
It's a perfect example of how the Korean brought the cultural understanding and boldness, while the American brought team resources for establishing the ongoing work, a true learning partnership.
The sources also highlight that partnerships involve a wider array of people, particularly through the explosion of short-term missions, or STMs.
Yeah, STMs. They're presented as a significant form of collaborative partnership, exposing literally millions of Christians to cross-cultural service. Eliseo Vilches is quoted calling STMs one of the strongest instruments of contemporary mission, noting their power to broaden perspectives and break down stereotypes.
And sidebar 18.1 in the sources lists a huge variety of ways STM teams can contribute. I mean, everything from construction projects and community service to language camps, medical clinics, leadership training, prayer ministry,
and even technical or professional support. This scope of potential involvement is really broad. It's not just one thing.
Beyond all these functional benefits, the material emphasizes the intrinsic value of partners working together. When they visibly demonstrate Christ's love to the world, they become a powerful testimony to the gospel's unifying power and show the kingdom of God at work.
Semé Maurice points to the theological value, stating that partnership reflects the oneness of the body of Christ. Churches working together can achieve more, even things that seem humanly impossible.
So it's clear these partnerships aren't all the same. The material describes them as diverse and dynamic, shaped by vision, resources, and maturity.
Exactly. Their structure can vary based on the number of partners. There are dyadic partnerships involving just two parties, like a congregation linking with a missionary team or a local church.
Dyadic partnerships are the simplest and most common, often seen in those STM agreements. They can bring significant energy, credibility, and resources. The missionary often acts as a broker initially and then moves into an encourager or advisor role.
And that research by Carl Brown suggests the competence and integrity of this point person is absolutely crucial. Makes sense.
Yeah. Then you have tripartite partnerships with 3 groups and complex partnerships involving more than 3.
Complex partnerships can bring together multiple expatriate churches, various agencies, and a local team, often tackling larger-scale projects. Examples cited include an evangelical free district partnering with Mexican churches for training and construction, or interdenominational coalitions like the Milwaukee Consortium supporting work in Indonesia. These larger efforts often benefit from dedicated facilitators who specialize in managing complex relationships.
Given the complexity and potential, what does the material say about making sure these partnerships are healthy and effective? It notes they require significant investment of manpower and energy, so wisdom is essential.
First off, they need a clear purpose. This isn't something to stumble into. The purpose must be prayerfully agreed upon by all partners, with a focus on the desired end result and joint evaluation of the fruit, both the measurable and the less tangible.
Clarifying expectations up front is also critical. What are the expectations around finances, decision-making, communication, and the very nature of the relationship?
And the sources point out that cultural differences play a huge role here. Some cultures are very task-oriented, others highly relational. Oscar Murray's observation about American directness versus African reserve. And the need for Americans to genuinely value local opinions really drives home how cultural misunderstandings can derail a partnership if expectations aren't openly discussed.
Flexibility is also described as vital. Relationships and circumstances will change. A written agreement might be needed, but it should often be seen more as a flexible guide than a rigid, unbreakable contract. Being adaptable in non-essential areas is key.
A bicultural mediator is highlighted as almost essential. In a fallen world, compounded by cultural, linguistic, and economic differences, misunderstandings are inevitable, right?
Yeah, for sure.
A mature missionary or local leader with cross-cultural experience can be invaluable in navigating relationships, explaining cultural nuances, and fairly representing the perspectives of both sides.
Patience is key in building a strong partnership. The sources mention the Spanish term relación de socios, which implies peer equality and trust, something that simply takes time to develop.
That's right. And North Americans, with their results-oriented focus and potentially unrealistic timelines, can sometimes rush this. Building that foundation of trust and consistent, healthy communication is absolutely essential for the long-term health and survival of the partnership.
A core principle is ensuring the partnership seeks to empower and that the benefit is truly mutual. The source quotes Partners International saying it's about collaboration without control.
Yeah, collaboration without control. I like that. The goal is giving resources or support with an open hand for the common objective, actively avoiding attitudes of superiority, control, or paternalism.
So it's a two-way exchange.
Exactly.
Right.
Of resources, yes, but also strengths, insights, hospitality, and values. The ultimate focus is God's glory and the growth of the kingdom, not one partner's agenda.
Establishing a fair decision-making process is also crucial. The partner with more financial or organizational resources can easily, even unintentionally, dominate.
Yeah, and local believers might feel pressured to agree or feel powerless, potentially leading to a lack of genuine buy-in or follow-through. Processes need to genuinely respect all interests and protect the integrity and autonomy of the local work.
And perhaps one of the most common sources of conflict and challenge is exercising wisdom regarding financial assistance.
Oh, definitely. The sources point to dangers ranging from stinginess to unhealthy dependencies or simply unwise administration of funds. While input and benefit don't have to be equal in every single transaction, all partners should be making sacrifices and aiming for kingdom dividends.
The material also outlines practical steps for the different stages of a partnership, recognizing they have a lifespan from being entered into prudently to being concluded graciously. Even if a specific project ends, the relationship can continue, perhaps evolving into something else.
They call this culmination and release. It begins with the exploration and conception stage. Potential partners prayerfully decide whether to explore collaboration.
This might be initiated by an established church looking to support new work, a new ministry seeking help, or a third party connecting compatible groups.
And the sources caution against rushing into agreements due to pressure, overwhelming needs, or mere excitement. Building common ground and shared understanding first is crucial.
Then comes the launch and empower stage, where the focus shifts to setting goals and plans. That bicultural mediator is really helpful here, apparently.
Yeah, and the point persons from each side need to be competent, mature, have integrity, and ideally possess prior cross-cultural experience.
Conducting an initial trial project is recommended in this stage, followed by a joint debrief and evaluation. Do we affirm the partnership, make adjustments, or graciously decide it's not the right fit?
And staying in touch between trips or visits through correspondence or even extended assignments is key to nurturing the relationship. Keep that connection going.
The growth and evaluation stage is when the church plan starts taking significant shape and local leadership emerges. This phase requires ongoing energy, attention, and flexibility.
Right. And the role of outside partners, like STM teams, shifts to complementing the local work, not leading it. Key questions become, what's needed for the plant to reach the next level of maturity and reproduction? How do we navigate obstacles together?
It's vital to encourage stewardship of local gifts and resources, and, if outside funds were involved, plan a gradual transition to local financial reliance.
And addressing problems and disappointments openly and immediately is critical, viewing setbacks as learning opportunities, and celebrating even small advances during evaluations.
Finally, the culmination release stage represents a mature, healthy rhythm of cooperative ministry where responsibility has substantially shifted to the local team.
The focus is on ongoing fellowship, mutual respect, accountability, and celebrating victories together. The sources stress the importance of planning for this conclusion phase. Without a plan, it can feel abrupt or like abandonment.
But affirming the relationship means the connection can continue, perhaps as a sister church link or even leading to new joint ventures, like partnering to plant a daughter church.
Now, as with any human endeavor, the material is clear that these partnerships are not without cost, and they are certainly not always successful. Conflict, like Paul and Barnabas parting ways, can happen.
Yeah. Establishing those evaluation patterns early on seems crucial.
The sources summarize common criticisms from various perspectives, which helps give a well-rounded view of the challenges.
From the viewpoint of expatriate churches, there's often an expectation that STM trips will result in significant personal spiritual growth for participants, almost like a spiritual boot camp.
Right. But research cited, like Randy Friesen's findings, that much of the initial change can regress within a year, or Kurt Verbeek's study of construction STMs in Honduras showing no evidence of lasting life change or changes in giving habits. Well, that challenges this.
I was expecting a trip to create spiritual maturity might be unrealistic.
Seems so. Maturity needs to be present before the trip for the experience to have a lasting positive impact. Sustainable change requires guidance, debriefing, and ongoing service after the trip.
Local indigenous churches, on the other hand, are often very enthusiastic about volunteers, appreciating their sacrificial service and contributions.
Yeah, the sources say STMs can help attract unbelievers, leverage professional skills, improve community ties, train leaders, and develop infrastructure like buildings or wells. That Robert Priest survey of pastors in Lima, Peru, found overwhelmingly positive views from pastors who hosted STMs.
Noting contributions in resource sharing, credibility, opening doors.
But here's a crucial counterpoint raised by Oscar Murillo. He suggests that STM members can sometimes arrive poorly informed, overly self-confident, and ill-prepared, which actually leads to less effectiveness.
Ouch.
He recounts experiences of teams arriving with a we're-in-charge attitude and prefers calling these short-term learning opportunities.
And Latin Americans have voiced sharp criticisms, warning of the risk of religious tourism when the planning and coordination with local churches are disregarded.
Yeah, questioning the significant investment of millions of dollars that could potentially be used more effectively, Sarin explicitly uses that term, religious tourism.
Traditional missionaries often have mixed feelings. They see the educational value of exposing people to global needs and the potential for STMs to occasionally lead to longer-term involvement.
But they can also feel overwhelmed by the logistical and cultural preparation required for visiting teams, sometimes finding themselves brokering between conflicting expectations or cultural norms. It adds a lot to their plate.
A major concern highlighted is the sheer amount of resources spent on STMs compared to long-term work.
It's staggering. Robert Wifnow's survey, citing McDonald, suggests 1.6 million Americans take STMs annually with a median cost of $1,500.
Do the math. That's $1.6 billion to $2.4 billion yearly from the U.S. alone.
Exactly. And Verbeek's study, noting a STM-built home costing $30,000 compared to a local build cost of $2,000. I mean, it starkly illustrates the stewardship questions raised.
The impact on overall mission giving is also complex. Does STM spending come from money that would have gone to long-term missions, or does it tap into new donor bases? It's hard to say.
And while the concern about amateurism is valid if teams are immature or unprepared, Garrison reminds us that amateur simply means doing out of love.
Right.
Many volunteers are highly skilled professionals whose involvement, often connected to their careers or trades, sends a powerful message to new believers about their faith impacting all of life.
So synthesizing these points, the consensus seems to be that channeling this massive lay volunteer movement towards greater long-term effectiveness is key. STMs should supplement, not substitute, traditional long-term missions.
They are seen as beneficial if they genuinely contribute to long-term goals already in place by the local partners and are well managed by coordinators who set clear expectations and don't become overwhelmed.
Better selection, orientation, training, and cost management are definitely needed.
And the source notes that the STM movement is largely a grassroots phenomenon that wasn't centrally planned, and it's certainly not going away.
And it's worth remembering, as the source points out, that many New Testament church planters were arguably quite short-term and held other jobs.
Yeah, that tendency for both short-termers and long-termers to be dismissive of each other is counterproductive. The greatest fruit seems to come when all partners recognize each other's strengths and collaborate towards a clear mission.
The material also adds that sometimes churches should simply move ahead without seeking partnerships. Relying solely on STMs, for example, can create undesirable dependencies or stifle bold local initiatives that don't fit an outside partner's model.
Ultimately, healthy, empowering partnerships, despite the costs and challenges, are described as bringing joy, energy, motivation, results, and synergy. They help all the partners grow and become more effective for the kingdom.
This raises an important question, though. Woven through all this discussion of partnerships is the critical role of money. How does finance truly fit into the picture of church multiplication, and what does the material say about handling it wisely?
Well, according to Garrison, church planting movements, or CPMs, thrive on indigeneity being sourced and sustained locally and internal momentum. He makes a really strong point, stating that linking reproduction to foreign resources is a sure way to cripple a movement.
Wow, cripple it. Okay.
So the key isn't necessarily avoiding outside money altogether, but understanding which financial practices help movements multiply and which ones hinder them.
One significant factor contributing to rapid multiplication, according to the sources, is relying on lay workers.
Yes. Multiplication often happens where planting is led by lay people or those who are bivocational, meaning they earn their living through other means and aren't dependent on church salaries.
This is seen as aligning with the New Testament pattern, where the apostles received help but didn't rely on it as a prerequisite for ministry.
And the Moravian movement is a historical example. They had a drastically higher ratio of missionaries to home members than other groups because their missionaries were self-supporting.
We see lay movements happening today, like the Movimiento Misionero Mundial in Peru. They grow by working with local people and local resources, starting house churches led by lay workers.
And they might offer limited temporary leveraging funds, rarely for training or simple meeting places if the workers demonstrate fruitfulness, but the help is explicitly temporary. It's not the norm.
This freedom from outside dependence is key, isn't it?
Absolutely. It allows these local churches to fund larger movement-wide projects like TV broadcasts or regional campaigns using local funds. Paid, salaried pastors can come later if the local body can truly support them.
Or churches can remain lay-led and channel their resources into further mission and extension work.
Right. Embracing an apostolic lifestyle is also highlighted for planters, especially in cross-cultural settings where support might be needed. This means adjusting expectations, embracing simple, sacrificial living, and sometimes needing to find other jobs, following the example of Jesus and the apostles themselves.
Samuel Nieva shares powerful examples of grassroots churches among the poor in Lima, not waiting for resources like benches or pulpits, but just starting with what they had.
A few people gathered.
And raising money locally through things like chicken roasts or clothing sales to meet needs. Incredible.
It underscores that CPMs can grow even in conditions of subsistence and opposition, proving multiplication isn't inherently resource-driven.
However, the sources also add a nuance. Lack of resources shouldn't be an excuse for inadequate preparation, and sometimes initial seed money can help.
True, though some leaders in Latin America do cite lack of funds or denominational support as factors in failure, it's complex.
But preparation shouldn't become a substitute for personal sacrifice and dependence on God.
Exactly. The point is that supporting churches, who often have unstable assets themselves, need flexibility and local ownership, praying and working together to discern God's call rather than relying on predictable outside funding streams.
That Colombian grassroots movement example is strong, supporting sacrificial workers on very modest amounts through local giving and part-time work, without outside subsidy.
Another point the material emphasizes is postponing costly programs and the purchase of buildings.
Wisdom is definitely needed here, especially when outside funds are involved. Historically, churches didn't acquire real estate to flourish.
Right. And missionaries from cultures where property ownership is common might assume buildings are vital. But in many contexts, new believers face job loss or even loss of homes living day to day.
So expecting every new community to acquire a building significantly slows or even stops planting and compromises organic reproduction.
While meeting places are important, a healthier pattern is starting with what they have: homes, borrowed spaces, and acquiring property later as the local church matures and can genuinely afford it using local resources.
In CPMs, buildings, if used, are usually simple structures built with local materials and labor. Otherwise, the attitude can develop that only outsiders can build.
And local builds are seen as inferior or insufficient, which is not helpful.
Teaching stewardship of life and resources from the very beginning is also seen as foundational. Good stewardship should be deeply embedded in the DNA of a healthy CPM.
Giving of oneself, of spiritual gifts, personal sacrifice, sharing possessions is vital to a reproducing church.
Oscar Muriu offers a sharp warning here, saying we must avoid importing resource-driven approaches that resource-poor nations simply cannot replicate. He states, we can design new models that do not depend on money.
And the practices of the first church movement described in Acts 4-6 provide a model. Real community built on love and trust, voluntary sharing, operating by grace, teaching all Christ commanded, including stewardship, leaders modeling generosity, freedom and honesty in giving, and fair distribution overseen by spiritual servants.
The sources acknowledge that outside resources can help, especially in the pioneering stage when there's no local church yet to provide support.
Right, but they must be used wisely so they don't inadvertently hinder the multiplication of healthy, self-supporting, reproducible congregations.
This brings us to a key tension presented in the material: the debate around the sharing of financial resources. It seems there are strong opinions.
Oh yeah, you see arguments on both extremes. Some advocate for no financial aid initially, focusing entirely on fostering local sustainability and avoiding dependency.
They might cite Paul's apparent practice and point to fast-growing indigenous movements that have followed this path.
And the dangers they highlight are real. Broken relationships, resentment, misuse of funds, manipulation, and ultimately hindering the advance of the gospel movement.
On the other side, some argue that sharing wealth across cultural and economic lines is a fundamental Christian obligation, part of the unity of the body of Christ.
They might cite verses like 2 Corinthians 8.13-14, which talks about equality and mutual supply. They might challenge the traditional three self-goal, self-propagating, self-governing, self-supporting, as potentially a Western pragmatic ideal that overlooks interdependence.
So for them, financial help is viewed as equitable distribution.
Right. The material concludes that neither extreme works best in all situations.
Right.
The answer lies in finding a balance. Yes, the biblical call to share wealth and pool assets is real, but it must be done in ways that empower, not control.
Actively avoiding attitudes of indifference from the recipient or condescension from the giver.
And the larger picture, the multiplication of healthy churches and the advance of the gospel movement must always be the guiding principle.
Situations are unique and demand careful consideration of local circumstances, culture, and needs. That discussion by David Marantz about complexities in Africa really highlights how different cultural views can be.
Oh, absolutely. On things like saving versus spending, paternalism versus partnership, independence versus interdependence, accountability, these deep cultural differences profoundly impact how financial aid is perceived and utilized.
So practically, how can outside funds be used wisely to genuinely contribute to long-term work and demonstrate solidarity without creating unhealthy dynamics? The material helpfully outlines 7 types of giving.
Okay, let's run through them. First, there are launching funds. Think of these as initial boosts to jumpstart a new effort where local resources are genuinely limited.
So, like funding for sending out the very first missionary team, temporary support for a national planter, evangelism campaign costs, maybe temporary meeting facilities or initial materials.
Exactly. That case study, 18.2, the Encounter with God project in Lima, Peru, is presented as an impressive example. A significant $300,000 launch grant with a comprehensive strategy,
Including evangelism, advertising, property, buildings, and critically, a plan for local refunding of the grant over time. And it grew significantly.
The guidelines for launching funds emphasize they should be limited in amount and duration, like jumper cables, removed once the work is running on its own power.
Right. Intended for one-time projects, not ongoing salaries.
Crucially, setting a precedent that launch funds are always needed for future church plants limits growth. Movements prosper when they learn to reproduce using their own local resources and methods. Local sustainability should be considered from the start.
Okay, second type.
Second are lengthening funds. These are designed to encourage and extend local giving capacity, often through matching grants. Maybe an outside partner contributes $1 for every $5 raised locally.
The goal being to stimulate local ownership and commitment.
Right. The guidelines suggest this is most suitable for one-time projects like building renovations or acquiring equipment. It's crucial to ensure the local contribution is truly local giving, not just outside money being channeled through local hands.
And caution with building projects.
Yes, they can become symbols of prestige or even tools for division. And matching funds for salaries are quickly problematic. They reinforce the need for a paid pastor and create ongoing dependence, hindering multiplication.
Got it.
Third, leveraging funds. This type of giving aims to enhance impact by investing in ministries that influence many others. The most common example is leadership development.
So investing in training centers for national planters, perhaps equipping them to be bivocational tent makers who support themselves.
Exactly. Other examples include sponsoring theological education by extension, producing reproducible literature or discipleship materials, micro-enterprise training tied to ministry, or Bible translation, things with broad impact.
Okay.
Fourth are linking funds. These connect newly planted churches regionally, nationally, or even internationally, supporting structures that are beyond the capacity of individual local congregations to fund.
Like sponsoring regional workshops, supporting area directors, or covering travel costs for leaders' meetings that build connection and strategy across a movement.
Precisely. Fifth, loving funds. This refers to the sponsorship of compassion ministries associated with a church plant, things like orphan care, medical clinics, or community development projects.
Demonstrating Christ's love in practical ways, serving the community, proclaiming the gospel holistically.
But a key caution here. It's often much easier for outside partners to raise funds for compassion ministries than for evangelism or church planting itself.
So a young church might focus on, say, an orphanage primarily as an income source, potentially neglecting essential evangelism and discipleship.
It's a real risk. Balance and integrity are needed to ensure the compassion ministry serves the broader church planting goal and isn't solely driven by outside funding streams.
Okay, number 6.
Sixth, lending funds. A one-time grant is used to create a revolving fund that provides loans specifically for church planting-related projects, like simple building acquisitions or capital investments needed for ministry.
With the expectation that the project will generate future funds for repayment, allowing the money to be lent out again.
Right. Guidelines note that repayment rates might be less than 100% in less affluent countries. And loans for small industries or microenterprises are generally best managed separately from core church planting funds. It's usually best to finance the core church and ministry activities through member gifts and offerings.
And finally, the 7th type.
Finally, lingering funds. These are subsidies that continue indefinitely with no clear plan or timeline for reduction, and the sources strongly discourage these.
And the reasons why make sense. They usually create unhealthy dependencies and can cause significant resentment when the outside funds are eventually reduced or stop. They're particularly difficult to manage fairly in contexts of large economic disparity.
The fundamental reason dependency is seen as wrong is that it cripples the multiplication of churches. The New Testament examples of financial help were occasional for specific needs like famine relief, not ongoing sustenance.
Practically, lingering support ties up resources that could be used to launch brand new works in needier areas.
Exactly. It also hinders local initiative, ownership, and decision-making power, making the local work susceptible to manipulation or control by the outside sponsor. One person in the sources called this creating an ecclesiastical welfare system.
So bringing the financial discussion to a close, the concluding guidelines emphasize strategic investment.
Given ways that are designed to lead to multiplication based on local resources and capacity. This means focusing on short-term projects, training, leadership development, and coordination that allows for a clear and easy transition to local finance and local leadership.
Churches should learn to reproduce using the resources and methods they have available locally.
Prioritize efforts that have no natural local constituency to support them, like regional training centers or initial cross-cultural compassion ministries over the ongoing operating expenses of a local congregation, which the members themselves should be encouraged to cover.
Avoid giving that stifles local initiative or creates those long-term dependencies we discussed. Supporting national workers, while seemingly helpful, can actually hinder a movement if it creates a model that is seldom locally sustainable or reproducible.
And a crucial warning. Do not give the impression, intentionally or unintentionally, that ministry depends on having outside money, fancy buildings, or paid professional clergy.
Right. The sources emphasize that the gospel has historically advanced most powerfully under adverse circumstances. Paid workers in buildings can be helpful tools, but they are not essential for health or multiplication.
Wealthy churches should be generous, but without implying that ministry stops without their ongoing financial involvement.
And finally, know the local culture, customs, and needs intimately, and listen carefully to local leaders. Outside aid can easily lead to dominance by those who understand the local context the least.
Giving should empower local people, respect their judgment, and consider the needs and objectives of all partners involved.
So there you have it. We've seen that partnerships, in their many forms, from historical examples to complex modern coalitions involving STMs and varied types of financial giving, are a powerful, dynamic force in church planting today.
They offer immense benefits, creating synergy, facilitating shared learning, and providing the means to tackle the overwhelming task of seeing the gospel spread globally.
But they also come with significant challenges, requiring careful navigation of cultural differences, managing expectations, and, as we've explored in depth, exercising wise stewardship of resources to avoid dependency and foster genuine local ownership.
Something that really stands out here is the inherent tension, the biblical call to share, support, and bear one another's burdens across the global church, held in balance with the crucial need for local initiative, ownership, and financial independence to foster reproducible, self-sustaining movements.
Movements that aren't tethered to outside resources.
This raises a really important question, doesn't it? When you're looking at a specific situation and considering all the different ways resources could be shared, from providing a vital launch pad to potentially creating a lingering dependency, how do you discern the wisest path forward? How do you truly empower local leaders and foster genuine, sustainable multiplication?
A question with profound implications for anyone involved in supporting global missions. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope this exploration gives you a much clearer picture of this complex and dynamic landscape of partnerships and resources in church planting.